All right, so I'm going to ask a few questions, and throughout this presentation, I'd like you to raise your hand, and if you're not quite sure, just pick something. It doesn't really matter too much. How many of those are on the red side, so the attackers, the pen testers, that sort of thing? Can I get a show of hands? 4? How many are on the blue side of things? Oh, okay. I was actually expecting a reverse there. So, given that most of the audience is blue, how many think they have a good grasp on how long it takes to actually investigate a red team? How many people reckon it's about 10 hours work for a one-day red team? No? Let's go 100 hours for a one-day red team. A few, okay, all right. The reason I'm up here talking to you guys today is because I found a really big disconnect between what a lot of pen testers think is the time that it takes to actually investigate a red team. I found that they thought they ran one Nmap scan and it would hit 255 hosts, and they'd think, oh, that's a couple of minutes work, when in reality it's very different. So what I'm going to go through today is basically, I'm going to go through a red team, and I'm going to go the red team, the blue team, and what you can do on both sides. And then I'm going to go through some of the real issues that are about and that compound the time that it takes to actually decipher what's happened in an engagement like this. And also had a recent Slack conversation on Sec Talks that there wasn't enough good blue team, so this is my attempt, blue team talk, so this is my attempt to actually solve that issue. Now, I've conducted red teams. I've actually been mostly on the other side. I've been defending against red teams, and I've personally had probably about 5 to 7 red teams against myself and the greater team that I work with. And I've picked up some sneaky tricks along the way, and not all of those are mine. But I've also picked up some interesting detection strategies which you may not have thought about. And we're going to go through these in a step-by-step process. So now, I wasn't born blue team, all right? It's quite an interesting story, actually. I interviewed for a job at actually CrikeyCon 1. That is a photo of Zane. Where's Zane? Is Zane here? Zane, put your hand up. I know you don't want to. That's a photo of Zane and I at CrikeyCon 1. Now, just to give you an example of how far we've come, look behind me there. That's a tarp over a window. Yeah. Taped to the window that someone had to rush out and get because when they put the projector on, there was too much light and no one could see anything. Now, clearly we can now afford colour printing because it's an A3 black and white CrikeyCon behind me there. And that was at the old Polish club at West End there, so that's going back a little bit now. We actually talked about, we scanned all of the IPv4 Australian address space just before G20. This was right around that time, just to see how vulnerable we were. I'm sure you can guess the conclusion to that talk. But that was actually a fairly uneventful G20, if you remember. Not a lot happened, which was quite surprising, but there was a lot of talk in the media that some cyber element may occur, but thankfully we never saw that. Now, my name's Ben Passmore, and I have the blue team blues. As you can see from this photo, I have a lot more grey hair now. I've gone a bit bald, and I've a bit more power here as well. I need to start some BTA meetings, Blue Team is Anonymous. I need to thank Stacey Gillespie of the JCSC actually for the name to the talk. Now, just before I continue, this is a disclaimer. The learnings from this presentation aren't from one employer, they're actually from a lot of people. I've combined a lot of people's learnings into this presentation, so my opinions are not my employers at the moment. A quick Google will tell you who I work for, but this is not them. So I'm going to step through a red team exercise now, and it's going to be a bit of a scenario. So we're going to have external attackers, and external red team, sorry. Excuse me. And their goal is to get an internal database. All right, they just need to exfiltrate this internal database, that's their flag, and they need to maintain some persistence. So usually the first step is some sort of reconnaissance. This is a form of passive intelligence gathering, and it usually provides the biggest amount of wealth of information in any red team exercise. And this can be from Shodan, Google, Maltego, all those sorts of powerful tools, and to get a lay of the land. And you can find a lot with a bit of Google Kung Fu. So that's usually the first step, and the important word there is passive. From a blue team side, it's like you're playing Where's Waldo, but you actually don't know you're playing Where's Waldo. This is really hard to detect any sort of reconnaissance against any target because it is designed to be passive. The attackers don't actually want you to know that they're looking at you at the moment. But there are some things you can do. Raise of hands how many people know what canary tokens are? A few? Okay, I'll go over it again just for those who don't know. So a canary token is some form of beacon. It can be embedded in the document, which is usually the case, and it can be an image that loads from an external site. And usually all this tells you is that your document was opened in X. It may give you a country, it may give you an IP address, that's about it, but it can just be open. So if you have confidential documents internally that shouldn't be shared externally, they can all contain canary tokens, and all of a sudden you'll be like, why has our document been opened in Kazakhstan? We're an Australian company. So that sort of technique can be used. There's a fair few companies that do this sort of technique, and it's quite good. And you'll see a lot of the marketing people use it for email marketing statistics as well. Now there's another thing though that actually sort of works, fake accounts. These don't always work. This is Ben Jemima. And a lot of the time you can put these up on LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever it may be, but to a degree you are actually breaking the terms of service. This is something we have had a lot of success with, okay? Especially LinkedIn. Putting up those fake accounts and you'll get, sometimes you're not quite sure if they're just like your profile picture or if they're actually some sort of attack waiting to happen. But if you look at your proxy logs actually, and you look across your proxy logs, and most of your URLs from most of your social media networks will provide a unique identifier for a profile. If you suddenly see a large portion of your employees look at a single LinkedIn profile, there may be something to it, all right? Because usually they just try and bulk friend anyone, and let's be honest, most people looked at LinkedIn at work at some form. So that's one way you can sort of detect the reconnaissance phase. But again, it's a bit. I'm going to remove that slide off the thing now. Yeah, thank you. All right. So the next phase, usually for the red side, is the mapping side of things. All right, they need to actively touch the external infrastructure and figure out what's out there. This can be anything you can imagine. It's a form of active intelligence gathering. You're using Nmap and spidering tools like Burp and those sorts of things. And it's really a way just to gauge their footprint. Now, most big companies have a fairly large footprint, and it's an issue for a lot of people. So let's imagine in this scenario you find about 1,000 hosts. You find they're running Telnet. Who runs Telnet anymore? That's pretty old. But you find they're running SSH and FTP and a whole lot of web servers as well. That's pretty commonplace for any sort of company. From this point, you'd think that the blue team would be able to detect some of this. Well, imagine you're an old grandpa sitting in your house, and this may be a euphemism for me, but I'm sitting there and you hear a knock on the door. All right, you get up, no one's there. You go back to your seat. Another knock at the door. You get up, no one there. All right, this continues over and over and over. This is basically what Nmap's doing against your external network. All right, it's a whole lot of alerts hitting the external facing side of your network, and it's noise. That's all it is, it's noise. You don't know if it's Shodan scanning you, which in some regards is a legitimate service. You don't know if it's an attack. You don't know if it's the Russians or Chinese or whatever it may be. It's noise. It happens a lot. Just go look at your logs. So from here, and one thing I want to talk about later is actually the alert fatigue. That's a very big factor in this sort of thing, so I'll get into that in a little bit. But there's some things you can do. How many people will realise that when you run Nmap by default settings, it actually emits that user agent you can see on the screen there? Okay, most of the pen testers in the room, maybe. But if you look for this, again, and this is pulled off my day job, but this is just an external web server that's been Nmapped, right? It's clear as day it's been Nmapped. It doesn't give me a lot of intelligence. It gives me an IP address, gives me a time. That's really about it. So as a pen tester, really have a look at what sort of signatures your tools emit, because sometimes we can pick them up quite easily. If you're red teaming me, please don't change this. So you've mapped the external network. You've figured out they've got about 1,000 hosts. You've got a fair bit of information out of your reconnaissance phase. It's ready to try and to exploit, to actually traverse inside their network. Low-hanging fruit. You know, we've probably all heard of that term before. You go for the path of least resistance. Telnet's probably that path of least resistance here. Turns out it's not available anymore, which is interesting in itself. When Nmap ran and we ran our mapping phase, it said Telnet was there. Is this a problem with our tools, or is this something that gets switched on, switched off when we're developers in the office or not? It's a ghost. So that's interesting. We go to FTP, SSH, and all those sorts of things, and we try the default passwords, admin password. None of that's working. They all require authentication. Hopefully that's pretty standard for most of us, but we have all been known maybe to have default passwords lying around somewhere. So from there, we can't really, the low-hanging fruit doesn't seem to exist, at least easily. But what we do find is we spend a few hours browsing all the HTTP websites that are exposed. We're looking around and there's nothing really terribly interesting, but we actually stumble across a browsable indexed directory. And for those who don't know what that is, that's just basically a listing of all the files on a web server, and it's been misconfigured or it hasn't been configured. We find a bash script on there, and lo and behold, booyah, it has a username password hard-coded in it. Okay? We try that username password in the FTP and SSH, it doesn't work. We'll keep this one for later. We'll put it in our back pocket for now. Interestingly, Google didn't actually find this during our Google Kung Fu reconnaissance phase. So, in regards to this low-hanging fruit, again, with the amount of noise that hits our external services, it's very hard to tell if someone's just poking you, if it's a red team, if it's, again, China or whoever it may be. It's very, very hard, especially the larger the company you get and the more diverse. If I had to action every single time someone scanned our network, I need a team of 1,000 guys working 24/7. It just would not happen. So we can't alert on every single instance, and we can't baseline it, because the noise just jumps up and down. It's not a constant noise. It is suddenly we're getting scanned from 500 hosts, suddenly we're getting scanned from none. So there's no pattern to it. AI doesn't work here, people. AI cannot solve that, at least in my opinion. But this browsable index, one way you could actually look for that is literally just scan your own web presences for the word password. You know, do a recursive wget and just do a grep for password. Do this once a month. You know, it may not work for 2 years, 3 years, but when it does, you better raise a red flag. And I have actually seen a company do this before. What I have seen, which is very unfortunate, is domain administrator credentials sit in a Google index blog in a bash script for 3 years that were still valid. The red team came along and look what we found in the reconnaissance phase, and they worked. Just because this guy had to blog about cats and thought he'd written this amazing PowerShell script, and unfortunately he'd hard-coded DA creds. So use a bit of Google Kung Fu, scan your own web servers, just have a look at your own infrastructure. Now, there's one thing you can do when it comes to external services, and if you haven't noticed already, I'm taking a bit of a no words on the PowerPoint view, but if you're a red team, you're probably scanning across FTP, SSH, Telnet, and let's say you are actually logging all those authentication failures. If most of the bots out there that are scanning you are focusing on one service, they're focusing on SSH, they're focusing on FTP, and they're hitting you hard. If you have the same IP address, the same user agent, some fact that is consistent across all those services in a narrow time frame, you could consider that maybe that's a more targeted attack versus than some bot that's scripting you. High noise ratio, yes, and if it's coming out of a VPN, that may be difficult, but these are the sort of things you can do to maybe differentiate the the noise from the actual targeted stuff. And if you're a really sneaky attacker, you could randomize all of it, but again, don't do that to me, please. So, we've just said the low-hanging fruit doesn't work. We need to get a little dirty. We need to go to an exploit phase. Usually this turns into basically you'd profile all the services that are running, you'd find their versions, you'd look up the CVE database, you'd find an active exploit. Something that's unpatched, something that you can easily break. And unfortunately, a lot of the red teams, this is where it falls over. We just don't have good assurance and patching in the external side, and they find something to pop. So in this case, it takes a little while, but they find a vulnerable web server, and they are able to get a web shell into an uploads directory of a web server. Now you'll see in the news, there's a lot of people using web shells, there's a lot of nation states using web shells. They're very effective, and they've been around for a long time. I started my career as the guy that wrote the PHP that everyone laughs at today. I wrote those websites. They probably still exist, which horrifies me. And I was always interested in security, but I became the de facto security guy because so many of our websites were getting popped with these web shells. And they're fairly easy to find if you know what you're looking for, but they're very similar to legitimate code. So it's very hard to eradicate them in some cases. Anyway, we've got this web shell in this upload directory, so booyah, we have compromised this company. From a blue team side, what do you reckon we can do? I sound like a bit of a broken record here. The web logs are noisy. Everyone's scanning us. We can't baseline this information. Well, you can look at some rare events. You can look at post requests. I had an investigation where there were web shells involved. The web servers in question, no one ever posted to that website. It was just a static site. And we were following the attacker who were randomizing their IP addresses based solely on the fact that they were posting or trying to post to this website. So have a look for rare values. The brain is geared to determine patterns. It's very good at doing that. I'll talk a bit more about that later. Also, odd headers and requests. Usually Python developers, if they're using some custom script, they maybe default, just like the nmap thing, Python requests, the library actually has a default user agent string, which sits there unless you change it. The other thing you can do is actually file monitoring solutions. All right? If you've got a really tight development process, every time there's a release, you can MD5 all the files and you can watch those files and if they change. Okay? And should one of them ever change in production without a release, there's an alert there. That requires a fair amount of overhead, but can be done. And also, you'd think antivirus scans would be happening on the uploads. I'm sure you've all seen you upload something to OneDrive, Microsoft, Google, and it says, just hang on a sec, I'm antivirus scanning this for you. That's also possible. But in this case, it's an uploads directory, which changes a lot. Some of these things aren't applicable or easy. And to be honest, from an assurance side of things, this just comes down to patching. We all know it. Install your patches and do some asset discovery. There are some companies out there, Shodan, Asset Note, and those sorts of things that you can pay, and they'll show you as much information as you need to know to see your external interfaces. And also, a lot of these web shells also emit signals in your logs. Quick Google will tell you that, and you can scan those through your logs as well. Now this is where it gets really fun. So you've now got a web shell, you're on the server, you've compromised it, you now need to do another mapping phase. Jackpot, you've hit 20,000 hosts, it's a flat network, all right? Pen tester's dream here. And this is very, very common, all right? From a blue team, mapping internal, it's sort of like the old man, except this time you're a principal in a school. You've got students knocking on your door. You know it's one of those students. You don't know which one. You've got a better chance of detection, but again, it's a little harder. But there are some things you can look at. So I'd hope most of us run AV of some sort. AV is actually very good at detecting port scans if you look close enough and if it's configured. I'm lucky enough to work from home sometimes, and I bring my work laptop home, and I plug it into my network, and about 1 in 5 times, this little pop-up comes up and it goes, port scan targeted attack blocked, and I freeze. China? In reality, it's actually just my Google Chromecast going, hello! But every time it happens. So you can imagine if all of a sudden 1,000 of your hosts internally flag this alert. And this literally just happened to me on Friday. 1,000, or not 1,000, in this case 300 semantic alerts suddenly popped up. We knew something was wrong pretty quickly. So have a look at those things, because the seemingly benign alerts that some of these tools produce, if you statistically look at them, it can actually lead you to maybe finding out that someone's running an Nmap inside your network. And I'm really glad that our internal red team guys aren't here, because I have that alert and they're not going to hear it. So hopefully I get away with that one for a little longer. The only thing you have to be careful of is vulnerability scanners. They'll usually trigger these alerts, but that's usually pretty easy because hopefully you run those and you know the IP addresses of them. So that's one thing you can do for an internal scanning. But again, it's not a be-all and end-all solution. So you've mapped the network, but something's wrong. Your web shell's a bit flaky. It's only accepting 1 in 5 commands. You need to obtain another method of persistence. And a lot of nation-state actors will do this. They'll use a backup form of persistence. So in this case, we're going to go for low-hanging fruit, the path of least resistance. We're going to find a Windows XP box. All right. We drop a PowerShell payload on there, and it's linked up to go to a dynamic DNS domain, and we just pray AV doesn't detect it. All right. And just like you saw Wayne a second ago, we wait that minute, and you get a connection. So you've got a second piece of persistence on there now. The persistence mechanism, the secondary persistence mechanism is usually a different form. So if it's a web shell, this time it'll be malware. If it was malware originally, this time it may be a web shell. It depends on what they can get, but usually it'll be in a different form. And it actually works to a blue team's favour sometimes because it increases the detection chances of that occurring, which again I've had before. We didn't know they were in, they dropped into the persistence mechanism, we alerted on that one, went, whoa, what's this over here? From a blue team, you just need to pray AV is going to work here. Raise your hands, how many people actually monitor dynamic DNS traffic? Anyone? Yeah, a couple? Good, okay. So you can block that sort of traffic, and sorry, I've just skipped a slide. You can block that sort of traffic and you can actually sinkhole it. Now, Fred in IT is going to probably want to connect to his home router to make sure Game of Thrones is downloading at the right speed. That's probably not something you should be letting through the work network. But it's something we do very successfully, and it annoys a few people, but most of the time, that sort of persistence mechanism, that sort of malware won't get out, and we, in some cases, can be alerted to it. The other thing you can do is scan persistence mechanisms. Right? So if this piece of malware is persistent, which it usually is, it'll survive a reboot, and you have some sort of EDR tool or SSM or something that can bring all that information back, you can have a look at it statistically and go, what are the rare values of persistence? You're going to get the Nero burns and the Clippies and those sorts of things.